Well, hey everybody, it's your boy Mr. Perry, and here we are with Unit 7, Lesson 3. Today we're going to be looking at how do we traverse an array list with loops. So let's go ahead and get started. So first off, we're going to just do a little bit of a comparison and contrast between arrays versus array lists based on what we've learned so far. So similarities, well, let's see. We know that both arrays and array lists will allow you to store multiple values that are indexed starting at 0. So same is true of strings. You know, again, all of the characters are in a row starting with the index at 0, so they have that in common. Arrays and array lists can both store reference data types, so strings, objects of a class, and so on and so forth. And you can loop through arrays and array lists using for loops, enhanced for loops, as well as while loops. But there are a couple of key differences to keep in mind. Arrays can also store primitive data types, whereas array lists can only store reference data types. Arrays never change length, but array lists can change their size when the add or remove methods are called. And that's going to cause us some extra concern with this lesson when we start to loop through and we start to add or remove. And then finally, there are multiple variations to the syntax when instantiating an array, but there's really only one main way to instantiate an array list. So there are definitely some differences as well. All right, well, let's look at how we would loop through an array and make some things happen. So given an array list of names, what we're going to want to do is we're going to find the name that has the most characters, or the longest name in this whole array list of names. So we're going to basically make a method, define a method here, public string find longest. And this is going to take in an array list of strings called names. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to find the longest name, and we're going to go ahead and return it as a string. So we need to keep track of the longest word. So we're going to declare a string variable to hold that data. And just like we did before, we're going to basically assume that the longest name is the one at index 0. This is just like we found the min and the max when we were looking at arrays. So we set the longest word equal to the first element in the names array list. Then we're going to use our for loop. And the for loop is set up almost exactly the way we did it before. We're going to do for int I equals 1, because again, we're going to loop through the remainder of the array list. And then the only difference is that we have to do names.size with the parentheses. You know, now that we're dealing with array lists have the size method, not the length attribute. So that's one difference there. But then from there, pretty much the code follows the exact same order that we did before. We're going to go ahead, for the sake of making this code a little bit more readable, we're going to declare another string variable and call it current word. And we're just going to go ahead and set it equal to names.getI. So as this is looping through, starting at index 1, it's just going to store it as the string variable called current word. And then we can just check if current word.length is greater than longest.length. So now we're comparing lengths, and because these are lengths of strings, we have to make sure that we use the parentheses, because again, with strings, length is a method. But now we're checking to see if the current word is in fact greater than the length of the current word is in fact greater than the length of the longest. And if it is, we'll go ahead and reassign this variable longest to be the current word. And from there, we're going to go ahead and finish up looping through the array list. This closes our if statement. This one down here closes our for loop. So once we've gone through the for loop, we can go ahead and return longest. And there you go. That's how we would do it. So hopefully that looked familiar to you. We certainly did something very similar when we looked at the min and the max for arrays. And, you know, again, this is basically the same method, the same strategy. Just had to make some adjustments with our syntax. Now we could do that same thing with an enhanced for loop. So for an enhanced for loop, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with string longest equals names.getZero. So that's storing the very first element as the longest. And now we need to do our enhanced for loop header. So we say for. Now we are looping through an array list of strings. So we're going to say for each string name in names. Again, that's how I read it to myself, or for string name colon names. And then it's just going to check if name.length is greater than longest.length, longest equals name, and then return longest. So when we use an enhanced for loop, again, it requires some minor changes, and we just need to make sure that we're using the right syntax here. Again, this is an array list of strings called names, and so we'll say for each string name, and then the colon, and then right here we need the name of our array list. And then inside of the enhanced for loop, we just need to make sure that we're referring to name, because that's, again, the variable that's controlling the enhanced for loop. And then finally, we'll look at how we could do this with a while loop. So again, we're going to basically do the same thing. You just need to remember that the structure of a while loop is a little bit different. You have to declare and initialize your loop control variable. And then you're going to use that loop control variable using in a condition that will execute while that condition is true. And then finally, you need to make sure that you update the loop control variable somewhere in the body of the loop. But after you account for this, the algorithm is no different from the other loops that we've used so far. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go ahead and set our index to be 0, because that's going to be our loop control variable, and it needs to start at 0. And we'll go ahead and say string longest equals names.getZero. And now we'll say while the index is less than names.size. That's our loop control, that's our condition. And again, we need to make sure that it goes through as long as the index is less than names.size. And now we're going to go ahead and do everything else that we did before. String current word equals names.getIndex. And then checking if the current word.length is greater than longest.length. And if it is, longest equals current word. So again, exact same algorithm. And then outside of our if statement, we need to make sure that we are incrementing our loop control variable. So here's index plus plus, and that needs to be inside of the while loop. That's very important that it's outside of the if statement, but inside the while loop. And then finally, once we've looped through everything, we can go ahead and return longest. So that's how you would use a for loop, an enhanced for loop, as well as a while loop. Now we need to talk about some of the things that can go wrong when you are looping through an array list and you start using the add or remove method, because these are going to change the size of the array list, and some strange things will happen when we're just trying to loop through and do something simple like this. So if you pause the video and read through this method, and just to try to make a prediction what you think is going to happen with this array, I would encourage you to do so. So go ahead and pause the video now and just kind of read through it and try to get a sense of what you think is going to happen. I assume you've paused the video. We're going to go ahead and continue. Let's look at what actually is going to happen. So in here, we're going to start with our for loop. So we're going to declare our loop control variable I and set it equal to 0. And so now it's checking if nums.getI, or if nums.getIndex0, which is the number 2. So over here, I'm just going to track what is nums.getI. Right now it's looking at 2. And it asks if it's equal to 0, which of course it's not, so nothing happens. So we're going to go up here, and we're going to go back into our for loop. We're going to increment I to 1. And now we're going to check if nums.get at index 1 equals 0. Well, obviously, nums.getIndex1 is 0, so we're going to go ahead and remove index 1. So that's now gone, which means everything else shifts down, and now it goes back into our for loop, and our for loop increments to index 2. So now we're going to check if nums.get2, and again, nums.getIndex2 is 0. So if it equals 0, we're going to go ahead and remove it. So now it's gone. And again, as soon as it's gone, everything else shifts over. And now we go back up into our for loop, and I now goes up to 3. And notice it went up to 3 because obviously this is 0, 1, 2, 3. So when that 0 shifted down and we went to our next index, we're now missing this 0. This is one that's been left out. And so we'll continue going. Obviously 12 is not 0, so it goes up to 4. And then nums at 4 is 0, so it removes it and everything shifts. And now I is 5, and I is no longer less than the size of our array. So the array would be done, but we'd be left with a problem. Because the size shrinks by 1 prior to the loop iteration, we skipped over this 0. So the question becomes, how do you fix this error? And there are a couple of ways of doing it, but one common way of doing it is what you see right here. If nums.getI equals 0, let's go ahead and remove nums at I, and then let's do I minus minus. So if you decrement I before you go back up into your for loop, then this is going to help solve that problem. And again, we'll just kind of quickly go through how this works. So back at the beginning, I is now set to 0, and it's checking if nums.getI equals 0, which of course nums.getI right now is 2, so nothing happens. So we go to our next index, and now we're going to go ahead and remove that 1. Everything shifts down. And now, temporarily, I goes down to 0, but then when we go back up into our for loop, I goes back up to 1. And so now we're checking if nums.get at 1 is equal to 0, which of course it's not. So nothing happens. So now we go up to 2. And so now nums.get index 2 does equal 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove it. Everything's going to shift down. And now we're going to decrement our I, so just temporarily I is 1, and now back into our for loop, I goes back up to 2, and now we're once again checking this one. So again, if nums.get 2, or index 2 equals 0, which it does, let's remove it. Everything shifts down. Let's temporarily take our I back down to 1, and now we're back up to 2 again. And so you can kind of see how just adding this one line of code helps make sure that if we remove something, we're not skipping over anything. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. If you're adding or removing elements from an array list, you can use a standard for loop or you can use a while loop so long as you decrement the loop control variable each time you remove an element. You absolutely cannot use an enhanced for loop if you're adding or removing elements. Enhanced for loops have restrictions on what they can do. So you can use an enhanced for loop if you just need to quickly access the elements that are in the array list, either for printing or for comparison. But if you need to actually change what's in the array list, you've got to use a standard for loop or a while loop.